some of the changes happening at the musical theatre in the 50s and the 60s are of course the result of what went before. The things like Showboat, the things like Oklahoma, the things like Porgy and Bess. So the shows that introduced new ways of making a musical and also introduced more serious subjects, especially what you might call social themes, and started to present the struggles and the perspective of the minorities, of the immigrants, of different ethnic and racial groups, and also other civil rights themes such as the LGBT themes a bit later, probably starting with Cabaret, and the protests against the Vietnam War. So if we look at the racial tolerance, of course it's visible in Showboat, it's visible in Porgy and Bess. There are quite a few shows that feature those themes. If we look at the works of Rodgers and Hammerstein, South Pacific and The King and I feature the subject of racial tolerance. Finian's Rainbow, this Irish musical, also has the subplot referring to the racial issues. So there are also the first shows that are made by black creators for black performers, and initially they would really mostly attract the black audiences, but soon enough this would be more generally accepted, and you would have the regular mainstream audience, so those tired businessmen, middle-aged, middle class, going to see the black shows as well. The first title would probably be Shuffle Along, but then there were more shows like that. We'll talk a little bit more about them when we talk about the nostalgic themes, but well, this was something new happening in the musical theatre, and I don't think this sub-genre has ever finished. There are still predominantly black shows or shows that focus on the racial issues, even if I would say not bringing this to the fore. I mean shows like Lion King, for example. Lion King is a black show with basically music inspired by African tunes, and most of the cast being black actors in masks and operating the puppetry, but still. So the racial themes. Then we have quite a few shows featuring Jewish themes. You have to remember that many of the creative people in the musical business were of Jewish descent. There were either children of the immigrants from the late 19th century, or the refugees escaping from Europe during the rise of fascism. So we have many shows featuring at least a subplot about Jewish characters, like for example Thoroughly Modern Millie has this scene of a Jewish wedding, like quite gratuitously added to the musical, but still. And of course the most important one here would be Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof, which is like kind of recreated Jewish village appealing perhaps as a distant memory to some of the audience members, or perhaps featuring in the stories of their parents and grandparents who came from Eastern Europe to America. There are other shows that feature Jewish themes. If you think about it, Hello Dolly features heavily a Jewish subplot, or basically main characters are Jewish, which is not made an issue of. It's not really the musical about tolerance, but well, the Jewish themes are there, or anything with Barbara Streisand in the cast. She became like the icon of Jewish musical. The roles that she plays, like in Funny Girl or in Yentl, it's all about Jewish girls from a relatively poor or completely poor background trying to fulfill their ambitions in the world and finding love and acceptance and success. There were some more musicals a bit less known than these that I have already mentioned. The titles like Milk and Honey or Rags, they all feature Jewish subplots. And actually, just to indicate, West Side Story was originally planned to feature the conflict between Jews and Italian Catholics. Then it's kind of changed into let's say Puerto Rican immigrants rather than Jewish minority, but it was in the process of creating this show. And then we start having the musicals with LGBT themes a little bit in Hair and in Cabaret, and then in the 70s and later more and more such shows like a part of a chorus line and La Cage aux Folles, which I mentioned already, and falsettos. And then, well, we'll definitely have a separate class on those themes because there are so many and they're so interesting. So, as you can see, the questions of social problems, of tolerance and racism and anti-Semitism and such things, not only in a historical perspective, like in Fiddler on the Roof, it could be seen as a contemporary problem as well. So after the success of Hair, and we are going to talk about Hair in a moment, the rock musicals start to enter the theater in America and also in Europe. The 70s marked the beginning of, well, late 60s, but it really takes off in the 70s, the beginning of the spectacular career of another great composer of the musical theater, the British composer Andrew Lloyd Webber, the man behind some masterpieces such as Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, and The Phantom of the Opera, Sunset Boulevard, Cats, a very controversial masterpiece, but still, I guess, a masterpiece nevertheless. He was, of course, not the only one following this example of Hair. There are other very successful rock musicals such as The Rocky Horror Show or Godspell, another musical based on the life of Jesus Christ by another very important, this time American, composer and lyricist called Stephen Schwartz. Stephen Schwartz, who is probably most remembered for Godspell and Pippin and Wicked. He's the man behind Wicked, and also his collaboration with Disney. He was the man who composed the music for many successful Disney musicals, such as Pocahontas and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and also The Prince of Egypt, about Moses. So if you watch these film musicals, these animated musicals, and if you like the music, and many people love the music because it's really memorable, Stephen Schwartz is the name to remember. So we have the rock musical. Rock musicals very often took a different commercial path than traditional musicals, because they began as many rock composers would advertise their work, that is, as albums, as records. The so-called concept albums, that is, before the show was staged, before it came on stage in the theater, which was a very costly and slightly risky, well, sometimes very risky thing to do. The music itself was introduced to the audience in audio form as a record, as a rock record, with let's say songs combined together to tell some story, but without any visuals yet. This was the beginning of Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita, for example, but some other shows as well. So if the concept album was successful, if it scored high on hit lists, then the creators would develop the stage version, they would develop the stage show. So sometimes these musicals are called rock operas. Some of them, like Jesus Christ Superstar, which we are definitely going to discuss in greater length because it's such an interesting musical, are sung through. It means they do not have spoken dialogue, or they have minimal spoken dialogue, and they very heavily feature the rock music. So the idea was to attract the new generation of theater goers. So in the 70s, what else do we have? We have some old-fashioned musicals still being staged, such as Annie and 42nd Street. We'll talk about Annie when we talk about children's musicals. 42nd Street was a kind of backstage musical about a young girl who comes to New York and wants to succeed on Broadway. Very traditional and very well received still. So you start really seeing different types or subtypes of musicals catering for slightly different audiences. With the black musical, probably the most successful black musical of this period is called The Wiz. The Wiz, like short of The Wizard of Oz, because it retells the story of The Wizard of Oz. This was the story beloved by many Americans, and of course a very famous, very successful film musical with Judy Garland, and the reworking, the new iteration of The Wizard of Oz as The Wiz was made, I think in the 70s, by an entirely black cast. There is a film version with Michael Jackson in one of the leading roles. It's not the best film, but it's interesting in its own way. Then, of course, the daughter of Judy Garland, Liza Minnelli. She's one of the great stars of this period, just as other great names such as Julie Andrews, the great star of The Sound of Music, and other musicals. Petula Clark, Elaine Page, Patti LuPone. This is when she starts her wonderful and still ongoing career. Bernadette Peters, the great muse and probably the favorite actress of Sondheim, who played in very many of his musicals. Barbara Cook, and also watch the documentary. You'll have the names, you'll have the excerpts of the work of these people, great dancers. Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly continued their careers. Ethel Merman, whom I mentioned last week, she also continues her career. That's really what happens in this period. And now we will move on to discussing the two selected musicals from this period I asked you to watch. That is Cabaret and Hair. And let the cat in. The cat. For next week, please watch some version of Cats. If you are feeling brave, you can watch the recent film, which is controversial. If you have seen it already, you might want to see, yes, meet Watson. Come here, Watson. Come here, Watson. Come here. No. You might want to see the film version of the theatrical performance. And what else? Something new, something modern. Cats is one of the mega musicals, so here we go. Watch Hamilton. Everybody's talking about Hamilton, and you have probably seen it already. Watson. So, Cats and Hamilton for next week. I'll be using mostly the recordings I made for the previous semester, but I'll be adding things to it. So if you suddenly see me with longer hair and it's a spring rather than autumn, don't get too alarmed. It was filmed in the spring for the previous edition of this semester, but I'm going to add to it, so there will be more. And next week we will have the live meeting, because this is going to be the end of a set of not next week, in 2 weeks time, after we do the 3 parts of the history. So we'll have a live meeting to recapitulate the first 5 weeks before we move on to the analysis of chosen examples, and then we will meet, if you want to, a bit more frequently, so you have the opportunity to discuss these shows yourself. So in the next part we'll talk about Cabaret.